Thank you so much, Sylvia. And welcome, everyone. This is the first Pop and Health seminar of this academic year. And we're delighted to have Dr. Casey Breen joining us today. So Dr. Breen is a senior postdoctoral fellow in computational social science at the University of Oxford. He completed his PhD in demography and MA in biostatistics. By the way, I have a master in biostatistics as well. So, share your passion in quantitative science, both at UC Berkeley. And his research develops and applies computational and demographic methods to examine questions in population health. In wildlife research, he investigates mortality disparities and dynamics in the United States using large-scale administrative data. In the second line of research, he uses network-based methods to sample hard-to-reach population and estimate mortality rates in humanitarian settings. So actually, I heard his two talks in the Catalat seminar. We went together last month, and it was so good. So I invited him over to our Wednesday seminar, and he's going to talk about something else today. So over to you, Dr. Breen.
Excellent. Well, thanks very much for that lovely introduction. So I'm really excited to be here presenting some early stage work in progress on mapping subnational gender gaps. So kind of mapping this digital divide using social media data. So this is joint work with some folks at Oxford, including Vidhi Kashyap, who's the PI on the Digital Gender Gaps Project, and Ingmar Weber, who's a computer scientist at Saarland University in Germany. So just to give you a quick overview of what I'm going to be talking about. So I'm going to begin with a quick overview of the Digital Gender Gaps Project. Then I'm going to discuss briefly our approach to using social media data to predict subnational digital gender gaps. And then I'm going to conclude with kind of a broader discussion of these subnational estimates and the way they can be used for original research. So broadly, the Digital Gender Gap Project is inspired and motivated by what we're calling the digital revolution. So this digital revolution has been ushered in tremendous societal and economic benefits. Just to give you some sense, so in areas where new mobile phones or internet was rolled out, there's lower gender inequality, lower maternal child mortality, higher rates of contraception, and women's feeling of empowerment surrounding contraception decisions. There's also some evidence, and so this is both kind of associative evidence and causal, kind of more causal with a formal identification strategy evidence, that digital technology boosts social connectivity, social learning, and access to vital services. It also increases overall levels of education and economic benefits, and there's been a few studies kind of pointing in a pretty clear causal direction that when new technology, especially mobile phones, are rolled out in an area, the average level of education begins increasing at a faster rate, and there's some large economic benefits. So I'd also like to just take this opportunity to say, if you have questions on this talk, I would love to get some interruptions, so feel free to jump in and ask your question at any point. If you're more comfortable holding your questions toward the end, that's totally fine too. So another final point of kind of the benefits of this digital revolution are that the benefits are actually often the greatest in the most unequal, disadvantaged areas. So when these new mobile phone policies or these new internet adoption plans are rolled out, we actually see the largest effects in the most disadvantaged areas. So of course, there's also this digital divide, which I'm sure everyone is familiar with at this point, but there's huge population inequality in who has access to digital technologies, such as mobile phones and the internet. And so this is especially true in low and middle income countries, where access to digital technologies is an increasingly salient component of population inequality. This is also especially true among women. So we see here that this digital divide is often most pronounced along gender lines. So at this point, this digital divide is pretty well understood and is also being implemented in kind of these broad global policies. So 2 of the most recent UN Sustainable Development Goals have focused on different aspects of closing this digital divide. So Sustainable Development Goal number 5 has a clause about reducing inequalities in access to digital technologies by gender. And Sustainable Development Goal 4 has as explicitly as a goal reducing digital literacy gaps. And so kind of the overarching aim of this project is twofold. So first, kind of fundamental to all of this. So yes, we do think that digital technology is really going to transform many aspects of people's lives across the globe. It has large implications for, population health when we think about public health campaigns being rolled out, telemedicine, predictive analytics, et cetera. But this all kind of hinges on this technology being available to everyone. And so there's kind of a strong demand to understand first, where are there gaps in digital connectivity and how we can map them. And so part of what this project does is it kind of builds an infrastructure to try and track these gaps over time. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about today, specifically kind of trying to do this mapping at the subnational level. So second, the project has what we call impacts research. So a series of kind of, original research projects trying to understand the impacts of digital information and capabilities on women's economic and social empowerment outcomes. And so generally this research is kind of cross-national, so comparing across countries and trying to take a comparative perspective. So just to give you a sense of kind of some of this original research. So there's been some research done, for instance, using LinkedIn data to analyze global professional digital gender gaps, so kind of size of different networks on LinkedIn. There's, of course, kind of some of the foundational research for what I'm going to be talking about today, how we can use data from Facebook ads to try and track digital gender gaps. And then there's also in 2020, a nice study in PNAS on leveraging mobile phones to try and attain some of those sustainable development goals and seeing how mobile phones can be used to help kind of close a lot of these gaps in population health and population inequality. So then also there's kind of this more data infrastructure side. So all the estimates from the Digital Gender Gaps Project are made publicly available. So I'm actually going to take advantage a little bit of the format today and briefly show off this website. So here we have the Digital Gender Gaps website. And as you can see, so this is a map of the globe. Some areas are whited out. Those are countries that we don't have estimates for. So you can see down here, I'll make it a little bit bigger. You can see down here, we have the digital gender gap. So red areas correspond to more inequality with respect to internet use. Blue areas correspond to more equality. So for instance, if we look over here at the United States, we can see if you click on a different country, it'll track that trend over time. We can see there's almost perfect parity. So both women and men in the United States tend to have access and use the internet at approximately the same rate. But globally, we can see there are some pretty stark disparities. So for instance, in the Middle East, or especially in sub-Saharan Africa, we can see that there's lots of inequality in who has access to digital technology. So just clicking on Saudi Arabia, for instance, we can see that we've estimated a digital gender gap of about 0.67 in 2019. This digital gender gap has stayed mostly constant. Maybe it's increased by about 2 points, making it a little bit more equal. But we can see that in lots of these countries, there's large inequality in who has access to the internet. and that these inequalities in some places are getting a little bit better, in some places, in most places, are staying about the same, and other places are actually getting a little bit worse. So just another two things that I want to briefly point out here. So first, all of the data that underlie kind of this dashboard visualization, you can download them all here through this website. So this is also kind of a data download platform. And so if you're interested in using these different estimates in your own research or for a research project, you can go here and download all of that data. And second, if you're interested in kind of learning more about the ongoing research there or getting involved in some of these research projects, there's a research tab here that gives you a little bit more insight into the type of different research projects that this project is carrying out. Great, so back to kind of the main talk. So here I've talked about kind of the two aims of the Digital Gender Gap Project. And now I want to talk a little bit about kind of the main thing that I'm going to be presenting on today. So I just showed you these national estimates of digital gender gaps. And of course, as everyone who's worked in this general sphere of population health or demography knows, that there's tons of subnational heterogeneity in pretty much every outcome. And adoption of digital technology isn't an exception. So here I have a map of Nigeria. So I filled this map in with estimates from the Demographic and Health Survey in 2018. Purple corresponds to very low rates of internet adoption. Yellow corresponds to higher rates of internet adoption, as you can see from this map, especially up here in northern Nigeria, there's very high amounts of places where people have almost absolutely no connection to the internet. So down here in the southwestern corner, we can see that there's much higher rates of access to the internet. Just to kind of put some numbers on this, so Sokoto up here, one of the provinces in Nigeria, only 2% of people have access to the internet in the past 12 months. And so, you know, these are 2% of the population are probably very highly select. Then down here in Lagos, which, you know, was the old capital of Nigeria, is much more modern, much more highly developed. Approximately 55% of women have accessed internet in the past 12 months. So about 25 times higher than had access internet back here in Sokoto. And so kind of the high level takeaway here is that one national level estimate of the total number of internet users or of some digital gender gap might be highly misleading because there's a huge amount of subnational heterogeneity. So the goal of the project here today is to estimate internet and mobile adoption by gender. So just kind of internet penetration and mobile phone usage by gender, and then also estimate digital gender gaps. So what I'm going to be focusing on today is the continent of Africa, because this is a setting where digital gender gaps are the most highly pronounced. We do have plans to eventually expand beyond just Africa to all low and middle income countries, but the talk today is going to focus exclusively on the continent of Africa. We're going to look at the first subnational unit. So there's 874 different subnational units. And so kind of how I think about this project is we have a map here where we have some estimates of digital gender gaps from the demographic and health surveys. But for most places, as you can see, they're whited out because we don't have any ground truth data on internet penetration, mobile phone usage, or gender gaps. So basically the goal of today's talk is going to be trying to fill in this map with estimates. So you can think of today's study a little bit different than most of my work as kind of a computational demographer. So most of my work is a little bit more inferential. Today's talk, we're kind of moving into this prediction framework. And the main goal here is going to be making predictions for each one of these different subnational units. And so, of course, prediction can also be, informed by theory as well. So prediction doesn't have to be entirely atheoretical. So broadly, kind of how I and my colleagues are thinking about this kind of prediction task is, so first, that these digital gender gaps are going to be kind of foremost shaped by overall levels of economic development in digital infrastructure. So if we're looking at something like differences in mobile phone usage in a country like UK, well, almost everyone in the UK has a mobile phone. So we're going to see really small disparities. Where this is more likely going to be, coming up, and the inequality is going to be more pronounced, is in countries that have kind of low levels of economic development and digital infrastructure. And in these settings, it's much more plausible that within a given household, for instance, only one person in that family can have or own a mobile phone. And so also all of this, will also be kind of mediated, and I'm using the term mediated a little bit loosely, by patriarchal norms and beliefs. So in lots of different countries, even for instance, Saudi Arabia, which has a rather high level of economic development, we saw really stark digital gender gaps because of kind of the patriarchal nature and the patriarchal society. So that's kind of broadly how I'm thinking about kind of the theoretical framework of the prediction. And now I want to talk a little bit about the overview of our approach. And so I know there's a lot going on in this figure, so I'm going to take some time stepping through it. So broadly, we have 19 countries where we have what we're calling ground truth data. And so the ground truth data is going to come from the demographic and health surveys, which I'll say a little bit more detail about these here in a second. But we also can supplement these demographic and health surveys with data from two other sources. So the first would be geospatial big data. So here we can think of this as kind of data from, population estimates from the World Pop, or nightlights estimates, etc. And then kind of the key thing that we're going to include in this predictive model is Facebook audience counts. And so Facebook audience counts is just a fancy term for how many people in a subnational unit actually use Facebook. So we're going to take these three different input data sets, and we're going to feed them into a kind of machine learning framework, and we're going to train a machine learning model. So that's basically how we train the model with data from 19 countries. And so, however, we're interested in making predictions for all 52 countries. And so what we're going to do is we don't have any ground truth. So for countries that have ground truth data and for countries that don't have ground truth data, we're going to use this machine learning model, and we're going to, as features in this machine learning model, incorporate our Facebook audience count data and our big geospatial data, and use all of those features in our machine learning algorithm to estimate digital adoption and disparity. So that's kind of the big picture overview of what we're doing in this study. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about each one of the specific different input data sets that we're using and how we collect them. So as I mentioned, the ground truth data is going to come from the demographic and health surveys. And so these are household surveys that are generally representative at the first subnational unit. So demographic and health surveys use a standard sample design, questionnaire, and implementation. And they also, since wave 7 onwards, include questions about individual level internet use and mobile phone usage. And so I want to put a small asterisk. So while largely, the questionnaire and the sample design are standardized across different DHSs, that isn't always the case. And more importantly, cultural interpretations, especially on what it means to be on the internet and use mobile phones, is something that can vary across different contexts. So kind of an important thing to keep in mind is that our ground truth data here isn't always perfect. And this is kind of just the best that we can do in this specific setting. So here in this iteration of the project, I focus on 19 different DHS surveys running from 2016 to 2020. So next, I'm going to talk briefly about Facebook audience count data. So the Facebook audience count data, and as I mentioned, this is just a fancy term for how many people in a given subnational region use Facebook. So this is collected through Facebook's public-facing and publicly available marketing API. So in theory, anyone can go out and create an account with Facebook and go and download these data. Then when you're actually making calls to the API, there's an API is basically just a way of saying some system that you interact with, you tell it what data to give you, it gives you some data in return. Basically, this API allows you to specify a specific geographic region. So Facebook has some custom built-in geographic regions at the subnational level. That's generally what we can use for this project. We're interested specifically in a GATA1 unit, so this is kind of a standard subnational unit. And Facebook's geographic units mostly map on, but they don't always map on perfectly. So we have a few tricks and workarounds there. And second, this API, you can specify how many users of Facebook there are by gender, age, and device type. So first I want to mention, so what happens when Facebook's subnational units don't align perfectly with the subnational units we're interested in? So that requires a little bit of technical engineering. So one way of doing this is you can have a subnational unit that you're interested in and create overlapping polygons or circles, do lots of different queries and add all of that up to get some estimate of the total number of Facebook audience, get some estimate of the total Facebook audience count in a given subnational unit. And so we only had to do this for about 5 to 10% of the subnational units, but I just wanted to kind of share that in kind of this computational social science sphere, there's always these types of kind of programmatic challenges. And these are things that, it can be very helpful if you can think of creative solutions too. So there are 10 different online predictors that we're using for this study. We've broadly defined our online predictors as anything that we're using from Facebook, and our offline predictors as anything not from Facebook. And so here we fit lots of different iterations of this model, and we wanted to pick kind of a parsimonious model that would be simple to use across time. And the 10 different features that we found that were very important, and by features I mean predictors, were Facebook penetration for women. So what proportion of women in a given area use Facebook, what proportion of men in a given subnational unit use Facebook, and then some estimate of the gender gap, so the ratio of female users to male users. And then a few other things that the API allows us to do is look at the specific device type. So often in these settings, the device that someone's using to access the internet is a really good proxy for their wealth and also for overall levels of development. So in Apple iPhone specifically, this is a very elite phone that's mostly used by people in other settings. So if someone owns an Apple iPhone, then we have a pretty good sense that that's going to be a much more affluent region, and also that that's going to be a region that's much more likely to have more internet users. Of course, Wi-Fi and 4G are also associated with internet. And finally, there's some urban-rural differences. So we included a predictor just looking at the proportion of people living in a rural area who access Facebook through a Wi-Fi device. So those are kind of the 10 different predictors that we're using from Facebook. Next, I'm going to talk briefly about the geospatial and population data. And so the idea here is that we want to have some predictors that are uniformly available and consistent across all subnational units. And so this is kind of a major challenge in that there's many predictors that we would love to add in, but that aren't available for many of the countries that we're interested in studying, especially countries that haven't done, for instance, a census for 10 or 20 years. So the three main kind of offline predictors that we're going to use are first, satellite-derived night lights data, population density data, and some other variables or some other features on overall levels of development. And so just to give you a sense of the full list of variables that we're including, so we have some variables on the educational index for women, the educational index for men, income for women, income for men. Then we have some broad constructed index of the gender development index. So this takes into account lots of different indicators like life expectancy, overall levels of development, et cetera, and compares those for both men and women. So this is kind of an important feature for predicting digital gender gaps. Then we also have two different indicators on the Human Development Index overall. So this is just looking separately for men and women in a given subnational region, the total amount of development. And so then we have a few population level variables. So on the population composition female, the population composition male, and also the population density in a given area. And so those all come from the World Pop database. Finally, we have night lights data. And so this is weighted within each specific subnational unit according to the overall population of that subnational unit. And that data comes from the Earth Observation Group, and the denominator is again going to come from the World Pop data. So we're interested in predicting 6 different outcomes. So the demographic and health surveys actually ask about internet 2 different ways. They ask about internet use in the past 12 months, and they also ask about internet usage ever. For this study, we restricted just to internet usage in the past 12 months because we're really kind of fundamentally interested in how people use these technologies in their day-to-day life, not whether 10 years ago they went to an internet cafe in a different city and were able to access the internet. So we look at overall levels of penetration for both women and men. And so kind of these are kind of going to be the first subnational estimates of internet adoption in these settings. And kind of more substantively interesting, we look at this digital gender gap. And so how we define a digital gender gap is fairly straightforward. So in the numerator, we're just going to have the female to male ratio of users of a given technology. So this could be the number of female internet users divided by the number of male internet users. And then in the denominator, we're just going to normalize this by the population composition of men and women. So the total number of women living in the subnational unit divided by the total number of men living in the subnational unit. So a gender gap of 1 corresponds to a perfect equality, and a gender gap of 0 corresponds to perfect inequality. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about our machine learning strategy. So whenever you're doing kind of one of these machine learning tasks or projects, there's always this question of, well, how do you pick the best machine learning algorithm for this specific project or specific prediction task? So I'm kind of the mind that often it's simpler, rather than just trying to, pick an algorithm as your best guess, fit lots of different algorithms and see which one of these algorithms has the best performance. So I do this in kind of a machine learning environment called SuperLearner. So this was developed by some folks in the biostatistics department at UC Berkeley. But basically, this is just an ensemble learning approach that's going to combine together different algorithms and test the performance using an a priori specified cross-validation procedure. And I'll talk a little bit more about this cross-validation. But basically, the big idea here is that in some settings, some algorithms will work better than others. But often when you can combine together predictions from different algorithms, you can smooth out some of the ways in which some of these algorithms don't do so well and get one model that's going to outperform any of the individual level algorithms. So that's kind of the intuition there. And also I should note that in general, the ensemble learner only does a little bit better than the best singular algorithm. But so in this case, I fit 9 different machine learning algorithms. So I fit a lasso regression, a ridge regression, elastic net, a polynomial spline, a random forest, a gradient boosted machine, just a basic linear model, and extreme gradient boosting algorithms. So those were kind of the many different machine learning algorithms I considered. If you have other machine learning algorithms that you think I should test out, I would be very curious to hear. But now to kind of show kind of the key results. So using all of the Facebook audience count data and the machine learning models, we were able to make these predictions for kind of a greatly expanded set of geographic coverage. So again, this left-hand panel are places where we have ground truth data from the Demographic and Health Survey. And this right-hand panel are all the places where we have modeled estimates based on this machine learning approach of combining these offline indicators with our various online indicators of Facebook users. And 2 small things to point out. So here we don't have estimates for Ghana just because they changed their subnational boundaries in 2019. We also don't have estimates for the Congo because here Facebook didn't allow people for political reasons to make queries of the total number of Facebook users in a given region. So that's why we have a little bit of sparsity on this map, but otherwise you can see it's pretty fully fleshed out. And there's kind of just a few small qualitative patterns I want to point out. So this is mobile phone ownership. And you can see mobile phone ownership is going to be highest in the more affluent northern tip of Africa and in kind of the southern part of Africa. And it's going to be lowest in the middle of Africa and especially the sub-Saharan region. So now we can do this similar exercise, except look for men and women separately, and also look both at mobile phone usage and internet adoption. So just zooming in, here we have internet use, and this is the exact same figure, except just with a different outcome. And so you can see that internet use is lower than mobile phone ownership. So people have access to the internet, unsurprisingly, at a much lower rate than they own mobile phones. And you can also see that the same broad patterns hold, where in the northern part of Africa, we're seeing higher levels of internet use, and in the southern parts of Africa, we're seeing lower rates of internet use. We also see similar patterns for men, except we see kind of across the continent, men are slightly more likely than women to own mobile phones. And finally, we can look at the gender gap. So again, think of this just as kind of the female to male ratio of using the internet. And we can see there's always, in all of these countries, there's some slight inequality. The inequality is the most heightened here in the sub-Saharan Africa region, where a man in some of these various different regions is going to be approximately 3 times as likely as a woman to have ever accessed the internet. So those are some of the results that I wanted to show today. And of course, kind of the question that I'm sure many of you have are kind of, okay, so how well does this model do? And how should we think about assessing model performance. So to test the model performance, I'm going to use a cross-validation design. And so here we're going to be testing the model performance on the 19 countries where we do have ground truth data from the demographic and health surveys. So I'm going to use two different approaches to cross-validation, and I'm going to briefly explain them. So the first is kind of your classic 10-fold cross-validation. So the idea here is that you have your training data set. So here we just use all countries where we have, all 19 countries where we have DHS surveys. And we split the data, randomly partition it into 10 different folds. We treat one of those folds as the validation data set, which we hold out, and we treat the other 9 folds as training data. Then we train our machine learning model on the 9 folds in our training data, and then we test on the 1 fold that we've held out, our validation data. And so we don't just do this for 1 fold, we do this 10 times, 1 iteration for each one of the different folds or data partitions. So then on each one of those iterations, we can calculate a separate error metric by comparing the true value of, say, internet use for that fold that we held out to our model-based predictions. So that's one cross-validation scheme. One limitation of this is that we really want to know, like, okay, so how are we doing when we're in a country when we have no data? If we're just randomly splitting it up into 10 different partitions, well, it's possible that we have some data for each country, and that might lead us to be a little bit overly optimistic about how our predictions are doing. So another approach is a leave one country out cross-validation design. And so this is going to look very similar, except instead of splitting it up into 10 different folds, we can treat each different country as a fold. So here we're going to basically have 19 different folds where each fold is the data from a different country. We're going to hold out all the data from a given country, train a model, and see how our model performs at predicting for that country, given we've given it no data from that country. So just to make that super concrete, so here we pretend we don't have any data from Angola. We fit a model using data from the other 18 countries, and then we see how well that model can do at predicting levels of internet adoption for different units in Angola. So those are the two different cross-validation designs that we used in this study. And just to give you some overall sense of how we did, so here I'm showing model performance through R squared, or the coefficient of determination. You can kind of roughly interpret these quantities as the total amount of variation in the outcome variable that your model was able to explain. So here on the y-axis, we have the variance explained. On the x-axis, we have lots of our different machine learning algorithms. We have 2 different panels. So the first panel is internet usage in the past 12 months. And the second panel is going to be mobile phone usage. And so you can see here that the orange corresponds to 10-fold cross-validation, conventional cross-validation, and the blue is going to correspond to leave one country out cross-validation. And across the board, we see that we predicted we're more optimistic about the model's performance if we use 10-fold cross-validation. So under a 10-fold cross-validation design, you can see that we're able to explain about 70% of the variation. Superlearner generally performed the best. So you can see here the ensemble or superlearner method predicted about 71% of the variation in internet for men and 73% of the variation in internet for women. But when we look at our leave one country out cross-validation, you can see that number declines. So then for men, we're only predicting about 62% of the variation. And for women, we're predicting about 55% of the variation. The other thing to note here is that while our superlearner is our top performing algorithm, the performance between lots of the different machine learning algorithms is pretty consistent. So broadly, there's a little bit of a bump to doing this fancy ensemble learning method, but the results would be very similar even if we were just using kind of a simple linear regression. There's only about, in this leave one country out design, between our simple linear regression and our superlearner, we're only seeing about a 10 to 20% increase in predictive accuracy. So that's kind of another takeaway here, is that yes, machine learning is going to help you produce more accurate estimates, but it's not magic. And the increases in predictive accuracy you'll get over a more simple model, are relatively modest. So next, I want to kind of zoom in on one specific country. So here I'm showing results for Nigeria. On the left-hand side, we have our true from the demographic and health surveys estimates. On the right-hand side, we have our model-based predictions. And as you can see, we're able to pick up this large, broad trends. So our predicted map is able to show that in northern Nigeria, there's much lower rates of internet adoption than in southern and especially southwestern Nigeria. But you can also see that there is some discrepancies between our observed estimated data and our predicted data. And so now I'm going to kind of dig a little bit more into these different types of error. So here on the left-hand panel, now I'm just plotting the difference between the observed and the predicted values. And in general, the error is pretty low, except down here, there's a few areas that are geographically clustered together where our predictions are off by about 10 or 15 percentage points. So here, basically, we're underestimating overall levels of internet adoption. So here's another plot, panel D, showing the exact same figure, except here what we're doing is we're plotting basically the residuals. So on the y-axis, we have the predicted. On the x-axis, we have the observed. And you can see a perfect prediction would be right along this 45-degree line. Generally, we're doing a little bit of over-predicting, but for Nigeria, the correlation between our observed ground truth and our predictions are pretty good. So this is about 0.89, which is a relatively high correlation. And so this isn't always the case. So now I'm going to show you our overall predictions of mobile phone usage. So here I'm combining together our predicted estimates using this leave one country out, so the more conservative of the two cross-validation schemes, and our observed. And so again, anything along this 45-degree line is a perfect prediction. And so as you can see, we're getting pretty close here with mobile phone usage, but this definitely isn't perfect. So we're able, our observed and our predicted have a correlation of about 0.75. So if somewhere has super high levels of mobile phone adoption, we're generally able to say that it has pretty high. If it has really low estimates of mobile phone estimates, if it has really low observed levels of mobile phone usage, we're able to pick that out. But again, there's a good bit of noise here, and this isn't perfect. For men, it's slightly less accurate, but still we're seeing pretty high overall levels of predictive accuracy. Finally, for the digital gender gap, we see that we are able to pick up broad trends, but there's a good bit of measurement error in our ground truth data. as we're basically estimating the ratio between the total number of men who use mobile phones and women who use mobile phones. So here, even if we had perfect predictions, we wouldn't expect to be able to see a perfect correlation between our observed and our predicted. We've done some kind of tests of this, and basically, if we had perfect estimates given the amount of measurement error in our underlying ground truth, we would only expect a correlation of about 0.85. And I'm happy to chat more about that during the Q&A. So then internet is substantially harder to predict than mobile phone usage. And so here you can see things start to go a little bit wrong, especially when the observed level of internet penetration is high. So when internet penetration is high, this method that we've developed is going to have a hard time picking out those areas. And so you can see here, so looking at this panel for women, you know, we do, when it's really low, we do okay. But basically after internet penetration is about 40%, we're systematically under predicting. And so that's something, you know, we're really interested in proving and thinking more about. So one issue that could potentially be explaining what's going on is if in these settings, women are using the internet, but they aren't using Facebook, then our estimates of the total number of women using the internet, because our model relies so much on who's using Facebook, is going to underpredict that. So that's kind of a big picture view of how our model is performing. There's also large variation across countries. So just to point out here, I showed Nigeria earlier. So Nigeria is doing pretty well. Rwanda, we also do quite well for. But a country like Gambia here, you can see that we're kind of systematically under predicting levels of mobile phone usage. So my kind of high level summary is that for some countries, this method is working really well. For other countries, there's more work that we need to do before these predictions are ready to be used by policymakers. So another kind of fundamental question is, okay, so you're using these Facebook data. Are the Facebook data actually helping your model make better predictions? So here we have in the top panel, whether or not someone owns a mobile phone. In the bottom panel, whether or not someone used the internet. We have it disaggregated for women, men, and the gender gap. The red dot here just uses our big geospatial data. So this just uses night lights data, population composition estimates, and different subnational development indicators. And so as you can see, for 5 out of the 6 models, when we add in our Facebook data, our model performance greatly improves. However, and so the x-axis here is R squared running from 0 to 0.6. So as you can see here, the one place where it interestingly doesn't really improve our predictions is for men owning a mobile phone. So another kind of more substantive thing to think about is the relationship between the level of mobile phone penetration and gender gaps. So on the x-axis, we have mobile phone ownership among men. On the y-axis, we have the mobile phone gender gap. And so as you can see, as mobile phone ownership increases, the mobile phone gender gap approaches 1, which is perfect parity. So broadly, our interpretation here is that as a country becomes more developed and as more people in a country have access to digital technology, digital gender gaps are going to increase. However, when we see that deviations from, so however, we're interpreting deviations from this line as evidence that there's other factors that are going to basically mediate this relationship between the overall level of digital adoption in a country and gender gaps. So basically, if there's a very patriarchal country and we increase the overall levels of digital technology in that country, that might somewhat improve this gender gap, so somewhat increase inequality here. However, it's not going to get us all the way there. So that's basically our interpretation of this figure, that as mobile phone ownership increases, we're going to see the gender gap decrease. However, there's going to be lots of variation depending on cultural norms and other factors. So there's a few next steps and future opportunities that we're thinking about with regards to this project. So first, we're interested in setting up regular collections to monitor trends over time. So what I've shown you right now is just a one-off collection. What we're ultimately interested in doing is setting up collections where we're collecting this Facebook data every week or every 2 weeks, and we're regularly updating this model so we can kind of in real time track digital gender gaps. And so one thing I think is kind of interesting about that approach is we've seen lots of kind of computational social science come out and make very interesting contributions where we see a one-off project that has some set of estimates at one given point of time. I think there's lots of value in kind of tracking these things in real time, nowcasting, as they change. So the second point, and I briefly alluded to this, is kind of digging more into when our model isn't doing so well. So what are kind of the major factors that explain when our model doesn't perform as well as we'd like? And what are potential other predictors that we could incorporate into our model to improve its predictive performance? Another potential direction we could go for some of the areas where we have really solid subnational estimates is we could consider going even more granular and doing a gridded approach where we calculate subnational gender gaps for instance, 50-kilometer by 50-kilometer grids. So those are kind of some of the next steps and future opportunities that we're thinking about using these data. So to give a brief summary, we're using Facebook audience count data to predict subnational digital gender gaps and subnational adoption of digital technologies. Using these Facebook audience count data greatly expands our ability to accurately predict digital gender gaps in countries that have no ground truth. There's also, as we showed in our different maps, there's huge disparities in access to mobile and internet technology, both between different countries and within countries. And so our hope is that these data can have some potential for allowing researchers to study population level impacts of digital technology. It could also help inform policy for where we can build new digital infrastructure and make other digital infrastructure investments. So I'm going to conclude on that note, but would love to take some questions, and thanks very much for your attention.
Thanks so much, Casey. So let's see. We're going to actually try to give the opportunities for students to ask questions. It's a little hard for me to see from here, folks in the room. Let's see if I can pin this. So I don't know whether, yeah, Cynthia, I can see you. Are there any hands in the room?
Not yet.
Okay, all right. Any students from the online audience wants to ask a question? Okay, Sophia, you want to come off mute and ask that?
Sorry, Lee, there might be some noise here, but thank you so much for your presentation. I just wanted to see if you could provide some clarification on what the FB audience data includes. Like, does it include all other meta platforms like Instagram and WhatsApp? Because there might be some differences in terms of the characteristics of people who use these different platforms. Like there might be a shift in younger people using TikTok, for example. I'm not sure how popular that is in Nigeria, but yeah, I was just wondering if there are these differences in terms of the users that you're including in your analysis and whether there's a way to adjust for that. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much. That's a great question, Sophia. So right now, in the results that I showed you today, we're just showing Facebook estimates. So we're not including Instagram or WhatsApp. So one thing I will say is that Facebook is still today by far the dominant social media platform across the continent of Africa. However, there are other social media platforms that are increasing. So we've started doing collections through Instagram. We're also thinking of other ways to expand. So on our list of potential other digital trace data that we could collect are LinkedIn data, Twitter data, and there's a few kind of local subnational Facebook equivalents that we're thinking about investigating. But I think broadly, my point would be Facebook is kind of, for now, definitely the dominant social media, but that might, as you pointed out, really change in the future. So we're trying to make sure that we're trying to get ahead of that and that we are collecting data from different sources. One thing that is unfortunate is that WhatsApp, which is really popular in lots of these countries, doesn't have a marketing API. So we unfortunately can't collect WhatsApp data, but we would love to. So hopefully they'll consider making a similar API. And of course, so this is all public data that we're going out and collecting through their API. We would also love someone from Facebook or someone from WhatsApp to give us their internal estimates as well. So that's something that we're always trying to have conversations with them about. I will say that we have done some internal work where we looked at their internal estimates of audience counts, compared them to the audience counts that we were collecting externally, and they align perfectly. So that was reassuring. But thanks very much for the question.
Okay, I see that Laurie has turned on her video. Maybe we'll go to you first, and then Terry, and then Emmy. You're on mute, Laurie.
Thanks, Casey. It was really interesting. I'm wondering if there might be a way, I mean, I'm not sure how useful this would be, but I liked your very first observation about the role of patriarchal norms and social norms sort of, I would say, moderating probably the impact of kind of socioeconomic status and digital, or access to digital or mobile phones. And, there are, I mean, if you were interested offline, I'm happy to talk with you, because we've developed some, our team and others have developed some indices using DHS data to measure sort of levels of patriarchal norms that are better, I think, than the GDI, or at least they're more directly relevant at a subnational level. So it might be something, if you think that would be helpful, that we could explore.
Great. Yeah, thanks very much. That's a really helpful comment. And so I guess my impression would be that, yeah, it sounds like those types of indices would be really helpful for making more accurate predictions, especially in the countries that they're available for. I think one kind of tricky thing would be thinking about incorporating a predictor into the model where we have it for some countries and we don't have it for other countries. So I would have to think a little bit more about that, and if there's a way we can incorporate that into the model. But stepping aside just from kind of the purely prediction side of things into kind of the more, to me, the more interesting substantive research, those sound like really valuable indices, and I'm really glad you put them together. And lots of people on our team are interested in how these online indicators, so how these kind of online aspects of inequality correspond to offline inequalities. And so I'm sure they and I would love access to those if you'd be willing to share them. So hopefully I can follow up with you after the talk.
Great. Thanks.
Excellent, thanks.
Great work.
Harry, you want to come off mute and ask your questions? I'm trying to see whether she's still here. Oh, sorry. Okay, right. I think Terry might have left. So Emmy, maybe you go first, and then we'll go to David in the room.
Sure, my question's quite simple. Casey, this is fascinating work. Thank you for sharing it with us. And I agree with Lori, moderator, not mediator. Sorry. We teach this stuff. So we think about it a lot. I apologize if you mentioned this in the talk, but to what degree does Facebook usage vary among nations in Africa? I'm thinking you mentioned something about political restrictions, for example. So I was just curious about that.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And so I don't have the exact numbers off the top of my head, but my understanding is that there is pretty substantial variation. So kind of conditioning on the number of people who use the internet, which again, we don't have great data on how many people in these regions use the internet, but conditioning on that, there is some variation. So it's making me think that that would be a really cool thing to think a little bit more about incorporating that into the model. So trying to somehow, even if we had kind of a national level estimate of the proportion of people in that country who are using Facebook out of all internet users, I think that would really be helpful, especially for some of those places where we're really underestimating internet use. Yeah. I think that could be a really nice way of thinking about that. So thanks very much for the suggestion.
Oh, no. Well, you've already thought of it. I have to say, I mean, the gender divergence is really interesting and relates to power, as Lori was pointing out and you were pointing out. But I was interested in just the overall levels and how they differ within nations. I think that's really important for us to know.
Great.
Yeah, great.
I think your hand was briefly up, but then do you want to ask a question?
Hi, yes, thank you. My name is Aja. Thank you for your presentation. It was really interesting. I'm wondering if, and I might have missed it earlier, but can you talk about the variation in age? I know that you were looking at women and men, but I think when we're talking about some of the differences between Facebook choice or use of TikTok, et cetera, if you all did an analysis in terms of age and how that might have impacted your presentation or your results?
Yeah, so we include age. So if I'm understanding the question correctly, so how we're thinking about age in our model is that that'll be something good for us to include as a predictor to try and control for the population composition with respect to age. So right now we have a few different terms in the model looking at overall age-specific composition for men and women broken up by different age categories. We also are thinking a lot moving forwards about how we can look at age with respect to who's using Facebook and who's not using Facebook. Because I think, as you mentioned, there's going to be lots of differences by age in who's using these digital technologies. So right now, all we're including as predictors is anyone who's using Facebook age 13 above for those 10 different predictors that I showed you in the talk. So, who's accessing Facebook on an iOS, who's accessing Facebook over Wi-Fi, et cetera. I think moving forwards, it would be very interesting to see if the predictive performance of the model would be improved if instead of just giving one estimate of everyone using Facebook by age, we split it up into different age subcategories. So yeah, thanks very much for the question and the suggestion. Did that answer what you were hoping I would?
Yes, it did. Thank you.
Great, thanks.
Awesome. I think we ran out of time, and sorry, David, we couldn't get your question in, but you have Casey's email here. You can definitely reach out to him and for those of you who are interested to have additional discussions. So thanks, Casey, again for joining us today, and we really enjoyed your talk. And happy holidays to everyone.
Yeah, thanks so much. You're a fantastic audience. Take care. Happy holidays.